in a network context, what is the coordination there? Issue counterparty risk was identified as a major issue relating to derivative market, swaps, etc. So my question is, coordination has two parts, where you need to share information, and two, where you actually need to harmonize or have consistency in rules. It seems that there is no debate in either the theoretical or even practical way. It's just that there doesn't seem to be a political willingness to tackle those three areas. Am I right? Or has there something been achieved, or what is being done?
Thank you. I'm not an economist, so I just want to make some general points. Of course, coordination was an important charter of the G20. I mean, the London summit, that was the formal charter given to it. But also, the other aspect of that was that process also was meant to lead to an inquiry as to how the basis of global economy is to be made more sustainable. That is the second aspect of it. Now, perhaps this is all consultative because it was not seen to be a kind of a binding commitment amongst the participating countries which were actually going to engage in exercise. But they set up various agencies. We talked about the mutual assessment process. We talked about the other committee, I forget the name, for exploring as to how the global economy can be made more sustainable, and a couple of other things. And one reason, of course, was that one was to look at, or they were to look at what kind of logistics and production and distribution chains were supposed to develop, which were not under the control of any particular country, however powerful. The point still is that the fact that such a large number of countries had collected, and with the talent and the experience that they had, it was also meant to be a mechanism for sharing of information, setting of norms for the debate, setting the norms for regulatory framework. And in one way, the fact that this kind of information could be shared and capacity developed as to how these emerging trends were to be identified and how one were to stay ahead of the curve, so to say. The main purpose being that the shocks and the suddenness of shocks which the global economy is experiencing, those shocks could either be minimized or certainly the countries prepared for that. So, or to cushion against that. So the point really, as I see, that when we talk about, the fact of the matter is 2008 onwards, you have one succession of crises after another. And the frequency of global financial crises, the fact that they are also impacting on the larger issues of climate change and so on and so forth, which, as was mentioned by Mr. Acharya, the window is closing. So the point that actually I wanted to really flag was that at the very least, I mean, you talk about the norms and regulatory so on and so forth, at the very least, lead the debate, the global discourse, as to how countries need to prepare themselves. And here the question is capacity building within countries, but also capacity building as far as G20 itself is concerned, which in a way was to be, again, its major task. So if we were to look at the future of G20, to what extent is it measuring up to it? And to what extent ideas can be generated to develop those capacities? Because otherwise, in fact, I remember reading the IMF inspector report as to why the IMF failed to predict the 2008 crisis. And they said the risk really was the risk of groupthink, that you actually, I mean, you pick up something, maybe it's engineered, and everybody repeats that. So this particular forum actually is meant to think differently and bring out all the sort of resources and the talent to actually, give the direction for global economic growth. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a difference between two types of coordination. One is, if every country needs to agree to do something which will benefit them all, which is like fiscal deficit, there's going to be a global recession, or why the original coordination worked, because everybody was afraid there could be a major, something like the Great Depression, so all countries went ahead, fiscal monetary stimuli. That's one. Coordination works in the sense that you might act faster than you would otherwise, although it is in your interest to act, so anyway you would act. But the other possibility, other kind, is when currently QE, if India would benefit if QE is slightly less than undertaken, right? So what each country has to do to coordinate goes against that country's interest. Then coordination is more difficult. And that is where you need some country to give up something, and is that at all likely? Yeah? And finally, there's a question of free riding, because even if everybody would benefit by doing something, some countries might say, okay, they are doing it, we don't need to do everything, then everybody stops. So this is the collective action problem. And that is where I think G20 can really, in delays in taking a policy where it's in everybody's interest, or to prevent free riding where there is a cost involved to a country in doing. So it's useful to distinguish between these types of coordination.
I actually fully agree with that point. And I think we have to set the expectations right in terms of where we can expect the G20 to be successful in coordination and under what circumstances and where not. And there were some where policy actions go into national interest and where coordination is much easier. I think it's very hard to see how a country will agree to, say, the Fed to tighten monetary policy because that will create some positive externality somewhere else, but will have a negative impact locally. I do remember, let's just remember that it means giving up sovereignty. And there was an instance where indeed countries agreed to give up sovereignty on monetary issues, which was precisely at the end of the Second World War in Bretton Woods, when countries were willing, after the traumatic experience of the interwar time, to essentially relinquish some of their sovereignty over exchange rates to avoid what was a big calamity at the time. But it took a big event. So I don't think we can expect this to happen kind of every other week. It is certainly not the point there. But in the crisis, I think the question is why was there actually monetary coordination? Why did the Fed agree to provide swap lines? I think it was because of the spill back, actually. That is, when you had already weak banks, you couldn't, and today we have global banks that are also exposed in other markets, you could not afford to add to that pressure, and that made it easier for the Fed to argue. But I want to go back, so I think we have to reset our expectations. There will be instances where the G20 will be helpful and can create some sort of coordination, and you were right, I had exactly the same impression when I was reading the last communique yesterday night on the fiscal side. We seem to be getting somewhere there. But I want to go to the other point that Chetan raised, which was about scarcity of instruments. And that brings me to the other side of the equation. And there I think also something can be done. And we talked about this morning about capital flows as well, capital flow management measures. And you were mentioning that there was a reluctance to use them because there's some stigma attached to it. So there is some work to be done also, and I think a global forum can help to, I want to say it may sound pejorative, but to make instruments fashionable, to make them kind of, put them into the mainstream. And I think that is one area. There's certainly a lot to be said also about managing these flows, not just through capital flow measures, but also macroprudential policies, which is another area, and you nicely talked about this morning as well. So I think there is another area. The third one is reserves. I think one of the very paradoxical things that we have is that countries accumulate lots of reserves at a high cost, yet when the crisis hits, they cannot use it. And again, there is some sort of failure here. I think is information failure. Again, this is an area where probably there can be a common solution found that will make things easier. It's about pooling of certain resources. Although it's a tricky issue because it's one thing to have really a liquidity shock But then the question comes also, at what point is it just a pure liquidity shock, and at what point is it really a reflection of fundamental deficiencies that have to be corrected? But I think, so we can think about both sides of the equation, and probably on both the G20 can help if this is well managed.
I mean, these are in the nature of comments. If you picked up any question, please go ahead and respond. And could I also ask Amar or Stephen or even Chetan, even when coordination has been successful, in the limited number of times that it has been successful, there have been gains to the system. Is there any assessment of how these gains have been distributed within the G20, notwithstanding what Andreas said in the morning, is that there are people there, not even in the G20, even within the G20, when there is an example of a successful coordinated policy, how have these gains been, is there some magnitude or assessment of those gains?
Let me have a go first. On that last point, very interesting. I've never seen anything that even remotely tries to measure those gains. And I think it's a challenge to the academic community. Because it's a serious point that actually, if the argument is that there were gains from coordination at that point, demonstrate it. I'll give you very, very, very quick reactions to some of these points. On financial stability, I have a slightly different perspective. I think actually the changes that were put in place post-2009, 2008, 2009, were actually quite successful. I think the creation of the Financial Stability Board, I think the impetus that the political backing of the G20 for that, for those reforms was crucial. You may not agree, and indeed there was, in the earlier session this afternoon, there were some views expressed that somehow or other the reforms weren't perfect. But nevertheless, if you look at what happened with Basel III, if you look at what happened with agreements on resolution mechanisms, I can't remember everything else, but generally speaking, the regulatory landscape looks much safer to me now than it did in 2008, 2009. Capital buffers have been built up, liquidity measures put in place. At least you probably will not see a repeat of the last crisis. I wouldn't go as far as to say that the rest of everything else is stable, but on the question of sustainable growth, it's a lot to do with language. As I recall it, that language first surfaced in Pittsburgh, the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. And strong was easy. Strong means faster. Balanced was kind of easy in the sense that we knew that there were big imbalances, and therefore more balanced meant less imbalances. Sustainable was always a fuzzy concept, and it's got fuzzier over the last several years, because sustainable can mean climate, can mean poverty reducing, can mean, and I think this is the sense in which it was meant at the time, where it means you don't go through the peaks and troughs. You have more trend and less extremes. And the financial regulation agenda, I think, was driven actually by that wish to avoid the crises. So to that extent, I think it probably been not as unsuccessful as people might say. The capacity building point, I absolutely agree with. It may sound politically incorrect, but my view is that the G20, before the leaders process, was actually in part an exercise in capacity building. I can remember, I'm old enough to remember the debates, the discussions that went on in the G20 back in the early 2000s, and Amar may or may not back me up on this, but it seems to me that the discussions as you went through time became better informed, better discussions, more sharing of approaches and knowledge. The problem, of course, is that you then run slap bang into your groupthink problem. If all policymakers across the world think the same, then they can all make the same mistakes. Spillovers, credit ratings. Sorry, I'm thinking from my notes. You made the point that cooperation requires every country to benefit. A collective action requires sharing of benefits. It's got to be Pareto optimal in the economic jargon, and that's probably right. My thought was, actually, you may be getting to a Pareto optimum on fiscal policy cooperation at the moment, because one of the real problems of national action on fiscal, relaxing fiscal policy, is that you fear you get hit by the credit rating agencies, by the markets, and you also know pretty much for sure that a lot of your stimulus will leak abroad. So others will benefit from your actions, and you may get hit by the market reaction. So all the more reason for trying to have some more cooperative approach to fiscal policy action. You know that you'll get a bigger bang for your buck in terms of spillovers, and you think that the problems you face might be lessened by acting together. And finally, on the sovereignty point, I hope we don't need another war to have an increase in coordination. I would just say, though, that the experience of the G20 since 2008 is they're one-off sovereignty shots. I mean, having a Bretton Woods treaty is really difficult to get out of. I mean, as difficult as the UK leaving the EU, I suppose. But getting out of international treaties is hard. Getting out of or ceasing to coordinate on some sort of understanding is relatively easy. So the loss of sovereignty is at the very most a one-off shot, which I think is easier to deal with. It is less of you're giving up less. That's my take on it. And I agree entirely on the reserves and global financial safety nets. Let me stop. Mark, do you want to?
My sense on the monetary policy side is just like in the fiscal policy, there was underlying differences in diagnosis and prescription. So on the monetary policy side, as Chetan very eloquently pointed out, Mantega's views was that the US eased too much, too quickly, and emerging markets did not have the instruments to be able to respond, particularly capital controls and adequate macroprudential. The IMF's view on this was that easing of monetary policy by the US and other major central banks was globally optimal, and it recognized the need for perhaps having some additional instruments, including macroprudential by emerging markets and developing countries. Also from the discussions came a recognition of the lack of effective global safety nets for emerging markets and developing countries. So I think there was actually a lot of positive aspects in the discussions. I mean, this is something philosophical that I was discussing with with Stephen, since we both spent a lot of time inside the room. And, in a way you could say, well, as some of the panel discussions implied, well, the discussions really are for naught. But I would say that here the road is as important as the destination, meaning the fact that you have policymakers and sitting down and hammering away at an issue. And, I'm not I should assure Stephen, I'm not a great fan of communique drafting, but you actually manage them. But I'm just saying that I feel that listening to that process is extremely insightful on understanding where people are coming from. And it takes the social capital build-up when people are willing to give and take in terms of international cooperation. So I would say my thesis on international macro coordination is, if you have the same model, I mean, as Chetan said, we have model uncertainty. And not only we have model uncertainty, we have Bayesian priors, okay, where people are coming at this with different viewpoints. Then it is very difficult to say, here is a common agenda of action. So the differences were not so much driven by narrow self-interest as much as, I would say, by kind of somewhat differences of views. As the global economy has entered into more and more difficult phase, there is a greater willingness to push the boundaries. So I think the fiscal policy is one example. The enhanced structural reform agenda is another example. The thinking about investment policy, the whole Juncker plan is actually like a proxy of fiscal policy, if you think about it. And that's what I've been arguing, that think about infrastructure investment as a fourth way forward. The Chinese contribution to it is innovation. So let's think about productivity and innovation. So I personally feel that, these are endeavors where, you should let the officials continue, but from the outside, we need to continue to see, are there really gaps that haven't been addressed, where there is a clear kind of intellectual agreement that this would lead to Pareto optimal outcomes. And at the moment, I think the two areas I would say promising are certainly perhaps, moving a little bit more on fiscal policy. But the second one, which I think is more promising, is to enhance the meaning of fiscal policy more to investment, so you can get quality investment for quality growth. I think that is something which the Germans and others might want to come along. But as think tankers, our job, I think, is to identify that possible, but as Rajiv was saying, in more specific terms, if we want to convince the policymakers.
Well, I'll clump up all the questions in one and address some of these issues also. I completely agree that in the West, for countries facing the zero lower bound, fiscal policy is really the main where the main action is. And in EMEs also, fiscal policy is more important than monetary policy in kickstarting growth, whether it's through structural reforms or generally providing a stimulus to aggregate demand. And I also agree that, and we all agree that, crisis prevention and certainly all the initiatives on financial sector reforms through the FSB or Basel or through the work the IMF has done has definitely been a game changer. But my fear is that if some of these other contentious issues aren't sorted out, EMEs may, or similar countries may begin to hang together, because it's better to hang together than be separate. And what that may kind of take the form of, this is what Andreas was talking about, was maybe possibly reserve pooling, because reserves are, costly way of buffering or of insuring yourself. So you may get subgroups kind of behaving in a certain way, which may lead to fractions in the G20. Remains to be seen how that plays. But yeah, thank you.
I don't think we should spend any more time on the G20. I think, but let me say thank you really to all of you, including Chetan, Stephen, Amar, and Thomas in absentia, and to all of you to participating in this. At very short notice, they have filled in for Arvind, and I'm sure Arvind, if he was here, he would have gladly agreed that this has been a wonderful panel discussion.
If Arvind were here, then there would be more fireworks.
Yes. But we will send him a kind of summary of the entire proceedings, not only of this discussion, but whatever has happened since the morning, and await his reaction. So, but let me invite you for drinks, cocktails before the dinner. Do have cocktails because it's been a long day. Thank you all very much.